people frozen in time. Ancient communities of the Roman Empire, once prosperous and vital, and written about by Latin scholars, had vanished. What happened? This was the great mystery that confounded archaeologists for over 1,600 years. Could they indeed have been buried in the depths of the earth? This is the story of a people very much like ourselves. Men, women, and children who had jobs and went to school, but who, in one 48-hour period, suffered a fate almost too horrible to imagine. Italy, the center of the great Roman Empire, the year 79 AD. On a hot summer evening, people in the capital city of Rome witness a strange phenomenon. A gray substance, almost like dirty snow, falls from the sky over the city. But this is not a snowstorm. 120 miles to the south, a smoldering volcano, Mount Vesuvius, has erupted in a burst of molten rock and ash. It was a disaster of apocalyptic scale. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, which had lived in the mountain's shadow for generations, crumbled into ruin. The people of these cities were condemned to a cruel fate, almost too horrible to imagine. Blinded by red-hot ash and choked by poisonous gases, they died one by one. As the eruption continued, their bodies were slowly buried in the layers of boiling mud and pumice until no trace of life or civilization remained. Never before in recorded history had such a densely populated area been victim to such a catastrophe. As time passed, these once vibrant cities faded from the memory of later generations. All that remained were their names on ancient maps and some artwork and treasures attributed to the cities. And thus, one of the greatest mysteries of history was born. For over 16 centuries, scholars and art lovers searched to unravel the mysteries of these lost cities. What had happened? They knew the answer lay buried deep within the earth, but no one knew where. Until a peasant farmer in the early 18th century happened upon one of the greatest finds in the history of archaeology. A vast chasm had opened in the ground near his field, revealing the remains of an ancient structure. An expedition was organized to explore the underground ruins. Suddenly, a light from an explorer's torch fell on a plaque inscribed with Latin characters. From a single word, Herculanensis, archaeologists realized that they had stumbled across the theater in Herculaneum, one of the cities that had been wiped out by Vesuvius. An ancient riddle was solved at last. It was an incredible discovery. And today, almost 300 years later, objects like this glass jar are still being discovered when archaeologists brush away the hardened mud. But such findings pale next to other more dramatic discoveries, like these skeletons of some of the former inhabitants of Herculaneum who did not manage to get away in time. Before its fall, Herculaneum was a prosperous city, as seen in the beauty of its houses, many of which had a lavishly decorated atrium. Dozens of bronze statues have been found in many of the villas, and are today preserved in the National Museum in Naples. These findings, lost for nearly 2,000 years, now form one of the world's greatest collections of bronze art. But the most important discovery took place inside the so-called Villa of the Papyri, which is still partially buried under layers of volcanic rock, an entire library with thousands of ancient scrolls. Carbonized but intact, these documents are still being unrolled by experts, so their contents can be deciphered. The finding of the papyri in the mid-1700s fueled the search for another lost city, Pompeii. It too was discovered by chance in 1756, a few years after Herculaneum. Even today, parts of Pompeii are still buried under volcanic rock, though most of its treasures have been brought to light. Despite the devastation by Vesuvius, a number of frescoes survived that helped put a face on this ancient civilization. This portrait of a wealthy merchant and his wife could represent any of the more than 10,000 inhabitants of the city. It was at this unimposing site, between Via Stabiana and the now famous Via dell'Abbondanza, that the remarkable painting was found. As archaeologists excavated the remains of this house, they found a portrait of the owner on the wall of a room. The fresco contained one small but noteworthy detail. The woman portrayed at her husband's side was holding a waxed tablet, which at the time was used for writing. Scholars deduced that the woman may have kept the books in the shop she ran with her husband. Not unlike some families today, the couple operated their business, a successful bakery and sales outlet, out of their own home. Despite all the advances of modern civilization, it is remarkable how little the basics of everyday life have changed in 2,000 years. Whereas today the shopping mall has become a major focal point of social and commercial activity, in Roman times it was the forum. Traffic and congestion were an issue then, even as they are now, and so the center area was ingeniously designed to be a pedestrian-only zone. Citizens would come here to take part in the public and social life of the city, or simply to enjoy a stroll with family or friends. The raised steps of the arcade weren't just for appearance. They were also to prohibit chariots, so visitors wouldn't have to worry about being run over by horses. In Pompeii, as in every Roman city, the Forum was the center of religious, political, and commercial life. The city's administrative offices and archives were situated in this square. Nearby was the Comitium, a place where male citizens went to cast their ballots. Though women were an important part of Roman society, they did not have the right to vote. But they could, much like today, have a strong influence on the view of their husbands. On the right-hand side of the Forum stood a building owned by the wealthy noblewoman Umecchia, who was descended from an influential Pompeii family. Nearly 26,000 square feet in area, it was one of the largest buildings in the Forum, roughly half the size of a football field. Archaeologists believe it was probably an important market where people could buy clothing and material, especially wool. One surprising discovery was the unearthing of these structures set near the entrance to the building. It may sound incredible, but experts believe them to be urinals, where the urine of visitors was collected to be used in bleaching and softening the wool. In a prominent location at the center of the Forum stood the Temple of Jove, or Jupiter. Standing over 40 feet high, it was the largest religious building in the city, with 6 columns along the facade. Of the temple's many statues, all that has survived is this head of Jove, the original of which is kept in the National Museum in Naples. Though little of the building remains, enough is known about it that it is possible to visually recreate its original splendor. In its time, this was the most important monument in Pompeii. The entire area of the Forum looked like this, with twin-level colonnades and the Temple of Jupiter in the background. Here also was one of the biggest schools in Pompeii, with classes held under these porticos. It seems discipline was a lot stricter in those days. This fresco shows a pupil being flogged by his teacher while classmates look on. In this open classroom, no one dared to complain. Pupils sat on the ground and teachers held the lessons outdoors with little regard to weather conditions. And in addition to all that, there was always a crowd of people and street vendors going about their business. To the left of the Forum lay the Temple of Apollo. It was a very popular place of worship because Apollo was considered to be the guardian deity of Pompeii. In addition to paying him tribute, people came here to use the sundial atop this column. Apollo was the god who regulated harmony and equilibrium, and thus also the passage of time. Not surprisingly, his temple was revered above all others except that of Jupiter, Apollo's father. One of the places most often visited in Roman times was the thermal baths. Built in 80 BC, the baths had separate entrances for men and women and also separate sections for bathing. This room was known as the tepidarium, a place where guests were always in hot water, so to speak. Its pool was donated by an industrialist from Capua named Marcus Nigidius Vacula, who made very certain everyone knew the gift was from him. In this room, with its ceiling open to the sky, was the pool of the frigidarium. It was filled with cold water, into which bathers plunged after having a hot sauna. Pompeii was built in the form of an oval about 2 miles around. A great wall with 7 gates surrounded the city. At this intersection once stood the temple of Fortuna Augusta, dedicated to the emperor's lucky star. Beside it was a portico with houses where people lived, and in the background was the arch dedicated to the Emperor Caligula. Historians today are able to recreate the appearance of these buildings in great detail, a tribute to modern science and archaeology. Like all Roman cities, Pompeii had an amphitheater where gladiators fought. The amphitheater in Pompeii is one of the oldest in the entire Roman world. Here in this very stadium, in the year 59 AD, an event took place that was destined to provoke the intervention of the Emperor Nero himself. During one of the contests, bloody and violent fighting broke out among the spectators themselves. Many were killed. Enraged by the scandal, Emperor Nero ordered the amphitheater closed for a period of 10 years. The decree was eventually annulled, thanks to the intervention of the Empress Poppaea. The Pompeians were thrilled to see their games reinstated. The gladiators were heroes, even worshipped by children, who used to draw pictures of their favorite fighters on the walls of the city. The gladiators trained and lived in a large palestra that was housed in an arcaded courtyard. It was part of the single complex that also held the Great Theater and the Odeon, a smaller theater or concert hall. For couples who wanted to enjoy a night on the town, this precursor to today's multiplex was the place to go. Plays and concerts were both performed in the Odeon. In Roman times, the Odeon was covered, so theatergoers sitting on the steps could enjoy perfect acoustics. The Great Theater was built into a hill, as had been done in ancient Greece. There was no admission charge for these performances. Rather, they were sponsored like today's public theater. Only here it was usually politicians seeking re-election who paid the bill. The plays were always put on during the day. To offer protection from the hot sun, an awning was held up by large poles. This is how the stage once looked. Unlike the theater, this bakery probably couldn't offer its products for free, but the store still saw plenty of business. The ancient inhabitants of Pompeii were great consumers of bread, as everyone could afford it. There was even the so-called dog bread, panes furfurius, which was served in the soup kitchen for the poor. Of course, even the best bread needs something to wash it down. But very few citizens were fortunate enough to have their own well. This column, which is linked to a large central reservoir, was used to distribute water. Records have provided some idea of what this junction looked like. Such fountains were located at many city intersections, where citizens came to draw water they needed for domestic use. The wealthier citizens who lived in Pompeii's most famous houses had it a lot easier. This one is called the House of the Vetii, two brothers descended from a family of freed slaves who made their fortunes in business. Eager for ways to show off their wealth, the Vetii family had statues erected in a garden surrounded by columns, and decorated the house with frescoes like these. Another noteworthy residence was the so-called House of the Faun. This luxurious home covered an area of more than 32,000 square feet, almost a whole city block, and was made up of countless rooms. The villa was adorned with many statues. This bronze figure was the centerpiece of what was called the impluvium, a basin used for catching rainwater that came through a hole in the ceiling. The house belonged to a woman named Cassia. Archaeologists found her carbonized body, along with earrings, a ring, and other jewelry held in a small bag. Another grand manor was the Villa of Mysteries, which lay outside the city walls. It was a farm that specialized in the making of local wines with names like Vesuvino. This is a reconstructed wooden press, identical to the ones used 2,000 years ago to crush grapes. However, the last owners of the villa, which takes its name from these frescoes, grew more than grapes. Their farm produced a variety of fruits and vegetables that they sold at the market in Pompeii. In a finding nearly as remarkable as the city itself, archaeologists have discovered the perfectly preserved seeds of many of the plants cultivated in Pompeii. From such evidence, we can see how agriculture played a vital role in the life of Pompeii. Each house had its own vegetable garden. For example, this is the garden of the so-called House of the Perfume Seller. Its owner planted olive trees in orderly rows with carefully tended hedges of myrtle and other shrubs. He also cultivated herbs, roots, and the flowers of many plants that were used as remedies against common illnesses. The Pompeians grew poppy seeds whose sleep-inducing properties they knew about, linen seeds used for poultices to treat bronchitis, or rue, wormwood, and fennel, which were used as they are today for cases of stomachache. Basil was not used in cooking, but to obtain a very delicate perfume that was very popular with women in ancient times. Many plants and flowers were not cultivated for their beauty, but to be used to make perfumes. They were diluted with the oil extracted from green olives, whose properties as a preservative were also known. Then they stored them in small glass jars. The various wines produced in Pompeii would be served in this ancient tavern. There were 118 such establishments in the city, which had a population of just under 10,000 people. In other words, there was one tavern for every 85 people. A famous night spot in Pompeii was the Tavern of Asilina, which lay on the Via dell'Abbondanza. This gives us an idea of what it looked like to its regular customers. Narrow and cramped, the bar was probably renowned not for its wine, but for its women. Their names were Smirina, Maria, and Egli, three working girls who were more than willing to supply clients with services of a sexual nature, which in all likelihood took place in a narrow room upstairs. We know one name thanks to writing found on the wall outside the tavern. It's an election poster promoting a candidate for what today would be called a councilman.
Vote Caius Lollius Fusco for aedile in charge of roads and public and holy buildings. The girls of Assalina and especially Smyrina call on you for your support.
Evidence suggests that in ancient Pompeii, wine and politics went hand in hand. Elections were held at least 20 times a year to fill various posts, and rich citizens seeking public office weren't above throwing money around to help their campaign. To further their cause, candidates sponsored gladiatorial contests or other forms of entertainment in the amphitheater. Even more persuasive were the huge campaign banquets, Roman orgies to which they invited all potential voters. Naturally, they also put up election posters written on walls in red or black paint, which invited people to vote for a particular candidate with the help of a rather imaginative slogan.
Vote Trebius for aedile. The bread vendors call on your support. Elect Seius Secundus. He has the Pope's vote.
Or else,
Caius Julius Polybius for aedile. He makes great bread.
in short, they weren't fussy about how they solicited votes. One wealthy popular baker, Caius Julius Polybius, even had election slogans plastered on the walls of his own home, begging house guests to cast their votes for him. We know what Caius Julius Polybius looked like, as well as two of his presumed relatives. Using advanced reconstructive techniques and working from skull fragments found in the villa, scientists have created a series of model heads that allow us to see the actual faces of Pompeian citizens. Here is Caius Julius Polybius, an aspiring politician in the elections of 79 AD, with his aquiline nose, thin lips, and high, sloping forehead. And this is the face of one of his relatives, a man in his 30s, wide-nosed, bushy eyebrows, standing 5'7", almost a giant for those days. Lastly, a girl, just under 5 feet in height, graceful oval face with large eyes. Imagine her with hair done up in a bun and skin lightly scented with a touch of basil. This person is Lucius Caecilius Jucundus, a banker whose expertise in writing sales contracts made his opinion much sought after. At the other end of the job spectrum was Caius Norbanus Sorice, an actor whose features befit that of a man of the stage. Proving that humor is truly universal, this amusing caricature is of a man named Rufus, a frequent guest at the House of Mysteries. The same human qualities that define us today were alive and well 2,000 years ago. All types of slogans have been found, revealing a people who knew how to look on the absurd side of life and weren't afraid to share a few intimate details about each other.
Salvilla is a big fatty. How can anyone love her?
Was written up on the wall of an ancient laundry, or fulonica. Another malicious gossip tells us that a certain Suavis dreamt of nothing but jugs of wine. And then there are writings of a lover. May Cupid's arrow kill me if I should ever desire to leave you. Written in honor of a beautiful woman by a bachelor endowed with a certain gift for poetry. The inhabitants of Pompeii knew how to get the best out of their simple provincial way of living. But one summer day, the passions, loves, joys, and daily life of the city would change forever by a power and destructive force greater than any Caesar. It's already dark when we reach one of the most important sites of current excavations, known as the Villa of the Chaste Lovers. As you can see from the skeletons of animals still lying here, and from the fallen jugs, this site is like an open book illustrating the dramatic moment of the eruption of Vesuvius. Before the disaster, frescoes adorned this owner's house. There were storerooms and sheds for the animals. Here was an oven and mill. It is because of this site that archaeologists are able to establish an exact date and time of the eruption. On August 24th, 79 AD, at 1 p.m., a dark column of smoke and burning ashes erupts from the volcano's crater. But this devastation is just the beginning. Around 7:30 that evening, a series of violent earthquakes rock the city. All through the night, massive tremors shake the city of Pompeii to its foundations, and citizens flee for their lives. The next morning, despite the damage, many people go back to their homes to try to save their valuables. What they see is a ghost town of empty houses and thousands of lost souls wandering around. The situation during the city's final hours is now revealed by archaeologists who envision an unending vein of horror. Between 6 and 7 a.m. on August 25th, the most dramatic catastrophe takes place. Masses of volcanic ash and burning gases rise thousands of feet over the crater and then begin to engulf the city. Red-hot sulfurous smoke sweeps down from the side of the volcano at more than 100 miles an hour. It is these dense, choking clouds that suffocate and burn to death the entire population of Pompeii. There is no escape. More than 2,000 people die. And the death toll is still rising as more bodies are uncovered. 250 years after the excavations first began. Covered by tin, this is the body of a boy of about 12. These other bodies are of people who were trying to take cover from the fury of the volcano, their moment of death frozen in time as they tried to escape. How could this entire population have been so unaware of the imminent danger lying in wait? A Greek scientist named Strabon had warned the Pompeians about the risk of an eruption of Vesuvius a full century earlier. And yet, this fresco shows they continued to regard it as a peaceful mountain covered in vineyards and olive trees. Today, as visitors survey the historic streets of Pompeii, the wonders of rediscovering this ancient civilization override the horrors of its tragedy. But it's a bittersweet chapter. The German poet Wolfgang Goethe wrote after his visit here in the 18th century, "Never has any similar tragedy given such joy to the generations that followed." Over 2 million people visit Pompeii every year. They come to see its art and marvel at its architecture, but most of all, to pay tribute to a society not so different from our own. A people who shared the same hopes, ambitions, and passions as we, but with a downfall unlike any other in history.